Hi, I'm and video games are art now. The people at Rockstar, the people at BioWare, the people at Naughty Dog have put everything on the line to make a game that's subversive, innovative, and a true evolution of the medium, creating yet another groundbreaking hit in the process. In The Last of Us Part 2, in stores now, perfectionism is the key. Directed by literal messiah figure Neil Druckmann, a man willing to get as much as possible out of his team, no matter the cost. With gameplay that appeals to as wide an audience as possible, and an attention to detail that should take 15 years to get right, you really have to wonder, what was going on at Rockstar? Naughty Dog. What did they have to do to get this masterpiece perfected? The Last of Us Part 2 has seemingly become a magnet for controversy recently. Everyone and their nan has an opinion on it, even if they haven't played it. I have played it, however, and I do have an opinion on it, which isn't really what this video is about, but just because I like you so much, here it is. It's a bit shit, innit? The main controversy I want to focus on surrounds the game's development. Earlier this year, an article appeared discussing the intense working conditions that went into making the game, all surrounding a word that's been popping up quite a lot recently, crunch. And I don't mean the tasty Nestle chocolate bar. Let's focus on that word then. Let's go down the rabbit hole and see what makes crunch such a big issue. Neil Druckmann is slouched in his chair. As Vice President of Naughty Dog, PlayStation's most acclaimed studio, he is directing 2020's most anticipated game, The Last of Us Part 2, a game that, like its predecessor, is a swan song for the console it'll define. But the thing he's playing for me right now is not so groundbreaking as much as it is broken. As the PlayStation 4 crashes, Druckmann turns to me. "Oh yeah," he says. "Game development is shit."
So, where do you think this guy should move?
I'd say this way. And let's make sure that sound effect we used in the last level fits in here too.
This one?
Yeah.
You know, I'm so glad I got into game design. It's cool to be able to create the kind of games that we play.
I know what you mean. And the training at Collins College takes less time than most people might think.
Can you believe we get paid to do this?
For a complimentary
How people see game design has changed a lot over the past few years. Gone are the days where you and your bros would sit in a nondescript brick room, programming cutscenes with controllers and a soundboard.
This one?
Yeah.
These days, game design is more transparent than ever, and with that, a light has been shined. Is it shined? Is it shone? Hold on just a second here. Ah, fuck it. A torch has been lit on one of gaming's more open secrets. But just what is crunch? And no, I don't mean the tastiness of chocolate bar. Crunch is a term for a period of time within development of a game where all hands are meant to be on deck. The norm was, this would come closer to the end of a game's development. Everyone would work as hard as possible to make sure the game was as perfect as it could be before release. And if you needed to stay for a few hours of overtime to cover that, so be it. But in recent times, this has happened earlier and earlier, with certain games going through months or even constant crunch time. And it's not exactly optional either. Think of it like this. You're working on some project, something random and worthless here, let's just say, The Last of Us Part 2, and your boss comes in and tells you that this guy's brain matter must look like a Jackson Pollock painting against the wall by the end of the week. But that would take 2 people 1 week, and you're one guy, and you can't, not hand in the work, this is your job. So you end up having to work twice as hard with usually very little benefit because overtime in the US game industry is unpaid. And Naughty Dog is supposedly notorious for these practices. Uncharted 4's development was plagued with rewrites and changes, with Amy Hennig, the lead writer of the first 3 games, leaving midway through, being replaced by Bruce Starley and Neil Druckmann. Unsurprisingly, this rocky development seemed to lead to most of the lead designers on that game leaving the company, meaning more new hires for The Last of Us Part 2. This puts more pressure on those working on the project who were there before, as new hires need to get into the groove of working at Naughty Dog, meaning more time needs to be dedicated to training those new hires, meaning more stress is put on the new hires and the old dogs as a result. And if those old dogs are staying late, others seeing that, wanting to make an impression on those in charge, will be staying late as well. That kind of mindset is swept under the rug, even outright encouraged by those at the top. In a GQ interview with Neil Druckmann, regarding the criticisms lobbied at Naughty Dog, Druckmann said, "We don't try to babysit people. We draw people who want to tell these stories, who want to leave a mark on the industry, and they're going to work very hard to do it. We need to put some guardrails so they don't injure themselves, but I don't think we could prevent them from working hard and still make the kind of games we want to make." Which is quite a way of spinning an incredibly stressful work environment into a positive. They love it. They can't get enough of being worked to the bone. That's just how we roll! Now, we know what crunch is, but why has this come to a head now of all times? What happened in the industry to make games like this?
Video games are too long.
It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly.
The Last of Us Part 2 is a long game, like, super long. It is longer than all three PS3 and Uncharted games combined, and it's the biggest game Naughty Dog have put out to date. And it's seemingly paid off for them. The game had one of the biggest launches of 2020, beating franchise titles like Resident Evil 3 and the Final Fantasy VII Remake. And as much as people can dog on Naughty Dog's practices or point at Metacritic user scores, that isn't an insignificant figure. Games are a much bigger beast than they've ever been, with budgets and development times skyrocketing to higher than they've ever been. As you can see, even though smaller games have stuck around, the average cost goes up fairly substantially, and with the next generation coming in and more companies pushing for new technologies, none of them have really tackled the issue of cost or how much time goes into development of these games. And that rapid expansion is not good for quality of work either, with more costs and more time, meaning more people need to be hired, which means that's just more people to exploit for the next big thing. The GQ article cites Uncharted 2 as a time in which the extremes of overtime were banned at Naughty Dog. That game sold incredibly well and got incredibly good reviews from critics. Uncharted 2 was released 2 years after the original. The Last of Us Part 2, by comparison, was only announced 4 years before the game came out, and that's taking into account how many times the game was delayed. Delays are a common thing in the industry now, with most big games that came out this year having a delay in some shape or form. And while that might lead you to believe that this is to alleviate stress off the backs of those making the game, the reality of it is that's really not the case. Delays usually lead to more overtime, which leads to more crunch. And I don't mean the tasty Nestle chocolate! You could be awaiting the day the game goes gold, so you can finally catch a break. But then that goalpost gets pushed a little further and you realise you're probably going to be there a lot longer. All of this comes together to make one thing very clear. Video games are too long. These games have a lot of time and detail put into them, and maybe if that's at the cost of the people who make them, we could tone it down a bit. We don't need the most realistic shirt animation you've ever seen. We don't need the really graphic image of that guy's head being caved in. It's not like this isn't a known issue either. Sean Layden, former PlayStation bigwig, pictured here looking like that Tim Allen movie where he kills Santa, said this at an event earlier this year.
It's hard for every adventure game to shoot for the 50 to 60 hour gameplay milestone, because that's going to be so much more expensive to achieve. And in the end, you may close some interesting creators and their stories out of the market if that's the kind of threshold they have to meet. We have to reevaluate that.
Which is a bold claim from the man who presented The Last of Us Part 2 in a fucking church, that they built from the ground up just to show off the game before we could watch a man play the flute for 5 minutes. But I digress. So then, where does that leave games as an art form? If games can't sustain themselves as a business, what happens to the art?
Druckmann has spent the past 7 years as one of the most famous developers in the world, but he contorts with discomfort when I ask about it. He's shy, introverted, unflashy, Apple not Patek, Tesla, not Ferrari. He walks with a subdued shuffle, a stark contrast to the confidence of his games. He tells me the pressure he feels most isn't the one from the fans, or from sales expectations, or any of that, but of making his team proud. A team he regularly talks about with the utmost pride himself.
You're asking people to follow you and work on this thing for years and give so much of themselves. They're all perfectionists, and you want to make sure they come out the other side and look back and say, yeah, it was fucking worth it. That quote is from the same GQ article I mentioned earlier, and I don't know if it's just how most interviews are written, but something about it feels weird, like pages of GQ magazine stuck together weird. It also speaks to something that has creeped its way over to video games from other mediums, the concept of the auteur.
French for auteur theory is a school of criticism that sees a figure, usually the director, as categorized as the top of the food chain, the be-all-end-all creative force behind a project, the tour de force, the cream of the crop.
Okay, yeah, fuck off. If that sounds bullshit, well, it is. Fun fact, most creative works are a collaborative effort, which have a lot of people making decisions for it. In games, this concept has been applied to many people, like Hideo Kojima, the man who made us ashamed of our words and deeds by showing us a woman showering. Ken Levine, the guy who made us think, yeah, maybe the revolutionaries fighting against racism are just as bad as the racists. And the auteur of the work at hand here, Neil Druckmann. Neil has had a fairly wild decade outside The Last of Us Part 2. He co-wrote and co-directed the first game, he took over as co-director on Uncharted 4, and he's received a lot of praise and flack because of that. Articles like the GQ one paint a picture of Druckmann as above everything, and while not all interviews are as odd as that one, the amount of coverage and discussion that specifically mentions him is staggering. And that spotlight on him has allowed the narrative of negative criticism to be influenced in a way that only benefits the game. Neil has done a lot to deflect specific types of criticism on his public social medias, while also showing off articles that feature a lot of praise. Don't get me wrong, there has been a lot of bad faith criticism. Anti-Semitism and bigotry are everywhere on the internet, and they seem to have converged a bit around The Last of Us Part 2. Yeah, hot take? Reacting to a video game not being to your taste with slurs isn't exactly the most constructive way of giving feedback. But most feedback that has been directly mentioned is that feedback. Criticisms of how the game handles certain marginalized groups, or specifically the labor practices at Naughty Dog, have been hand-waved in generalizations. It's interesting to note that the only other mentions I can find of the Kotaku article or its author Jason Schreier are in response to him calling out a fairly odd tweet that compares The Last of Us Part 2 to Schindler's List. He also made an indirect comment about the games being too long tweet on a podcast, where he says that Schreier is wrong about marketing because making the game long was a creative decision, without actually discussing why that decision could increase the workloads of a ton of people.
Fuck, I'm gonna get in trouble for this. I don't care. Someone recently said games are too long. And part of like their thread, they were saying like, it's because marketing wants to say how big games are, and that's how they're gonna sell the game. In my 16-year career at Naughty Dog, marketing has never, not once, gave us a creative note to say, this should be in the game, or the game should be this long, or this short, or have this feature. Not once in my entire 16-year career has that happened. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It just has never happened to us. The game is this long because we wanted to make it that long.
Good job there, Neil. Really taking it to the haters by only calling out Schreier when he's making a joke, Neil. Glad we're standing up for the right for your game to be compared to Schindler's List, Neil. And not the rights of those who make that game, Neil. Ow. Neil, whether intentionally or not, by only signal boosting Schreier to paint him as mocking and rude, and only addressing criticism that is the worst of the worst, and objectively incorrect, has created an us versus them narrative, removing any nuance from discussions, where positives are absolute, and negative criticisms are made by bad actors, who only seek to mock Neil and his precious little baby. Propping Neil up as the be-all end-all creative force on the project puts him in the spotlight, only highlighting this false divide further. It depicts the discussion as Neil versus the haters, as opposed to people questioning why the workers at Naughty Dog have to be put through this to serve whatever creative ideas come from the top. Side note, Neil is not the only one at fault for this. People like Evan Wells, the president of Naughty Dog, are just as guilty. But for my point, I want to focus on Neil because he is the head of the project. But if our old buddy Neil is given full creative control, with his vision trumping any and all business sense, how is that paid for? What do we need for Neil to make his little baby perfect? Hey kids! Do you like video games? Do you like deep emotional stories that explore the intricacies of cycles of revenge and feelings surrounding losing a loved one? Then show off your love with our new range of The Last of Us Part 2 themed products! We got t-shirts, jackets, hats, journals, a brick keyring, guitars, special editions, collector's editions, Ellie edition, so you can explain to your mum why you have a book with a woman screaming on it on the coffee table. And hey, if you need to catch up with the story, you can buy The Last of Us Remastered, which luckily includes all the DLC. Just kidding, shotgun execution for the multiplayer. And exclusively for GameStop, The Last of Us Part 2 Joel Funko Pops. Available with or without the blood of the Dr. Joel murders in the first game. So come on down and give us money. And remember, we can't make art without your credit card number. These are Funko Pop vinyls. I know this seems like a weird tangent, but stick with me. These little dead-eyed bastards have seemingly taken over. You can't go anywhere these days without tripping over an avalanche of Valerian in the City of a Thousand Planets Funko Pops in a clearance bin. The Last of Us is the latest media franchise to get their own versions of these little abominations. And something about that in particular, along with all the other merchandise, strikes me as strange. The Last of Us is seen as this prestige franchise, something that can show off what games can be, that change the way we view our protagonists and the situations they're in. They feature people who do awful things for survival. They really shouldn't be idolized. It feels weird for a game to tell you really shouldn't idolize Joel and you should think about the violence you're committing, but then turn around and say, please buy shotgun executions and tiny bobbleheads of your favourite characters. The Last of Us Part 2 isn't even the bottom of the barrel with this. Video games are on everything now. Brand deals are abundant. Even Crunch got rolled into this. And I actually mean the tasty Nestle chocolate bar this time. The Final Fantasy VII Remake struck a brand deal with Nestle, which is wild for the game about the dangers of late-stage capitalism. They want you to connect with the game before it even exists, to invest money into it before you can even have an opinion on it, before you know what went into making it. It ends up stripping the game of any meaning it might have, putting it down to the bare minimum of what it is. A brand. Before I continue, I just want to put my thoughts out there on the art debate. In my eyes, any creative work, product or not, is art. I don't think there should be any debate around that, because art does not denote quality. There is good art and there is bad art, and all of it is subjective. However, I think the debate ignores a fundamental part of games as art. They are product first and art second. And without realizing that, it allows us to stay ignorant. I think that ignorance allows awful practices to keep going, because it ignores the reality of the work, that being how the people who made the product are treated. Separating art from the business is impossible. And as such, separating The Last of Us Part 2 from the crunch is impossible, as The Last of Us Part 2 is a product of the crunch that made it. Ends do not justify means, no matter how well made that end is. So in a weird way, these little guys end up representing that. They're a clean and polished version of something much darker. The meaning of what it represents is lost, so you have a cute little guy to put on your shelf. And hey, we can ignore that and just continue to fill our shelves with them, or we can face the reality of the situation and try to do something about it. I've touched upon it before, but I've spent a lot of time focusing on Naughty Dog in this video, but at this point we all know they ain't the only ones guilty of this. Which makes you think, how deep does this rabbit hole go?
If I could get EA CEO Larry Probst on the phone, there are a few things I would ask him. What's your salary would be merely a point of curiosity. The main thing I want to know is, Larry, you do realise what you're doing to people, right? And you do realise that they are people, with physical limits, emotional lives and families, right? voices and talents and senses of humour and all that, that when you keep our husbands and wives and children in the office for 90 hours a week, sending them home exhausted and numb and frustrated with their lives, it's not just them you're hurting, but everyone around them, everyone who loves them. When you make your profit calculations and your cost analyses, you know that a great measure of that cost is being paid in raw human dignity, right? Right?
That was a quote from a live journal detailing the human costs of the work practices at EA. It has a lot of similarities to the recent reports that came out about Naughty Dog and countless other companies. The big difference was when it was written. It was written in 2004. This is not a new problem. And while that might not be news to some people, it is to me. As I dug deeper and deeper while researching, following links and sources and articles, it became apparent how widespread this issue was. It even affects some of the biggest releases of the year. Cyberpunk 2077 has been delayed 3 times as of writing. CD Projekt Red has openly admitted that crunch will be inevitable in that time. This part of the script is wrong now. As of filming, like literally days ago, Cyberpunk 2077 was delayed again, and CD Projekt Red are in the middle of a fucking shitstorm because of their awful practices. Marvel's Avengers is based on one of the biggest properties out there right now. It's a guaranteed moneymaker, yet the most they're willing to give their workers for overtime are prize raffles. 3 companies that the Live Journal specifically mentions as being out of the reach of larger corporations, id, Blizzard and BioWare, are all owned by those larger corporations these days, and all 3 of them have been caught sipping from the well of overtime and crunch. The Live Journal ends on a somewhat bittersweet note, asking how long these ethics can sustain themselves. Well, we are 16 years removed from that Live Journal, and day by day, new reports about crunch are still coming out. If anything, it's gotten much worse, with the rapid expansion of the industry meaning we need more and more new talent, meaning more and more broke college students or people just looking to get by, following their passion, are going to be exploited just for a game that's going to be forgotten next month once the next season of fucking Fortnite comes out. Actually, even fucking Fortnite does it. Epic were accused of this exact shit when Fortnite got popular, and it keeps happening. Time and time again. How is one person ever meant to fight against a system that is so far above what one person can oppose? What reason is there to stop? When the bottom line is all that matters, it doesn't matter what art actually is. The cycle will go on and on and on as long as it makes money. Nothing else matters. Well, much like The Last of Us Part 2 wants us to reconsider our morals and ask who the real enemy is, there's a shadowy villain behind all of this, one that's been around for ages. Of course I'm talking about... Hey, don't go. I know how this looks, but there's a point to it. I promise. Look, I'll tone it down a bit. Please, just don't go. See, look, I brought back the funny little guy. See, it's all fine, it's all good. None of this is worth it. Even if The Last of Us Part 2 was a good game, which, you know, it's not, it wouldn't be worth a single thing because of the system it was made under. Thing is, though, as much as I'd love to say just don't buy products that push that system further, it's not very realistic. And I'm not saying it doesn't help. This copy of The Last of Us Part 2 that I bought for the video, I bought it used, but also, fighting a system on its own terms is a zero-sum game, because all that does is encourage the system to adapt to new circumstances. It changes nothing. So, theoretically, the best way to combat a system that unjustly exploits its workforce is to uproot the system that we currently have, and the best way to do that is to support the unionization of the game industry. Having a large amount of people in a union working as a middleman between management and the workers allows the workers to negotiate for better conditions, giving them the leverage that they need to make sure they are paid right for the work they do and that they are not exploited. Game Workers Unite are an organisation who are fighting for that to become normal in the industry, to stop situations that are all too common from happening again. This is the kind of widespread systemic change that we need to make a difference in the industry. If you want to know more about that, I'm going to put a bunch of links in the description so you can read more about it from people who are way more well versed in this shit than I am. If we support wide changes and those fighting for those changes, it will lead to a better industry for us and those working in it. There's this stereotype of the tortured artist, that the best art is made through suffering, and while that hasn't been transferred wholesale over to the game industry, it's easy to see parallels to it. It's a harmful stereotype that paints real issues as positives and ignores the reality of this situation. And I don't care if games get shorter, or if they look worse, or if we won't get the most realistic rope physics in a game. If that's what it takes for the people making them to be treated right, then so be it. And if we need to burn it all down to get there, then that's fine too, because a system that exploits its artists for profit margins or 20,000 different game awards that jest charcuterie of brand deals and Muppets is not a system that should be given praise. Art is not suffering, and we shouldn't let it be. Just kidding, do you really think I'd actually burn that? Do you know how much these things cost? Yeah, it'd be thematically appropriate, but I could sell this and buy Gundam model kits or something. But now that you mention it, burning something would be like a really good end to the video, you know? Something cheap and worthless that I've kind of propped up as a symbol of the things I've been criticizing in the video. Huh.